Okay, welcome to our next webinar, Right Plastic, Right Place, presented by Susan J. Susan is a circular economy technical specialist. She has many years' experience in driving circular economy initiatives across a wide range of sectors. So today, Susan will explore the role of plastic in our current society, looking at existing recycling infrastructure and areas for improvement. She'll also discuss the role of policy and regulation in the UK and how this can be used to drive innovation and change in the way that we handle plastics after their first use. As always, there'll be time for Q&A session after Susan's presentation, so do submit your questions in the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen at any point during the webinar, and I'll ask these on your behalf at the end of the presentation. So thank you for your attention. This webinar will be starting shortly.
Thank you very much, Rihanna. And good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar. So just to explain that I am actually based in our Welsh office, where we're very proud of our sustainability work and the things that we actually do in Wales. So moving on very quickly on to the core purpose of this webinar. Okay, so as Rihanna said, we want to explore this afternoon the role of plastic in our society. So what we think about plastic as individuals, as communities, as an organised society, and to look at our attitudes to plastic and how we've perhaps exploited it in ways that we might live to regret going forward. And then also to look at what the opportunities are to actually change our attitudes and perhaps do things a little bit differently. And then I want to look at the role of government and policies, regulations and things that they take on board that are to some extent working, but perhaps need to be adapted to actually drive the right behaviours, to drive innovation and to improve the circularity of plastics in society. And then also want to look at the role of business. They've probably been the frontline target for much of the criticism around plastic and the way we use it. So very much in their hands in some respects as to how we might change the way we do things. And then last but not least, to actually examine the current infrastructure we've got here in the UK and what we might actually need to manage plastic going forward so that we're not exporting our problem plastics to other parts of the world, leading to the issues that we've seen going forward. So before I go any further, I just want to tell you a little bit about WRAP, which stands for the Waste and Resources Action Programme. We've been around since 2000 and WRAP Cymru in particular since 2008. I won't bore you with going through our vision, but you can see from what's on the slide that clearly what we do, whether it's talking about plastics or glass or metal or all sorts of other products, then we are very, very focused on supporting not just governments, which is how we are funded, but also supporting businesses and individuals to readdress the way they think about the resources we use in our society. So straight into plastics. The role of plastics in society. Now I'm going to be a little bit controversial here and actually say to you, plastic is amazing. It is a fantastic material. For something that has come out as a byproduct of the oil industry and has only been with us since around about the 1950s, it's developed into the most amazing product. It's versatile, it's durable, flexible, waterproof. You can develop gas barriers. You can do so many other things, but it's incredibly cheap as well. So it's incredibly functional in terms of the way we use it. But it can also save lives. We use plastic in an amazing array of medical applications. And so next time, perhaps you're unfortunate enough to have need of the services of our NHS, you might want to take a little look around the room there and see just how much plastic is used in the various medical applications that we use. But also importantly, it protects our food. So we're all aware of the plastic packaging we've got that actually enables us to move food not just from a local farmer to our table, but halfway across the world, but without it spoiling, without bacteria building up, without putting us at risk of quite serious illness from contamination. So again, plastic can save lives. Also, plastic reduces carbon emission. It's no accident that a lot of manufacturers have changed the way they package their goods and moved from perhaps glass or cans or other materials to plastic, because it makes the product a lighter weight. It actually reduces the amount of resource used in delivering that product to us. It reduces the carbon emissions used during transportation, and as I mentioned earlier, reduces food waste. So incredibly significant in terms of what it can deliver in benefits to our society. And we've got really used to having all of those things, as it were, on a plate. And we're now producing over 300 million tonnes of plastic globally. And that's predicted to rise almost exponentially to the figures you can see here by 2050. But unfortunately, in our enthusiasm for plastic, we really haven't thought too much about what happens to it once we've finished using it. And although it's very difficult to actually get really accurate figures, there's no mistaking the fact that significant amounts of this material are dumped in the ocean every year. Or if not actually dumped, then in some way actually makes its way through our river courses, through the soil, into the ocean. And perhaps even more frighteningly is that every single ton of plastic material that has ever been produced since the 1950s, discounting a fairly small amount that may have been incinerated, that material remains in our environment today. So I suppose it's no wonder that actually we've built ourselves up a fairly significant problem. And as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have highlighted, by 2050 they estimate that there might actually be more plastic in the ocean by weight than fish, which really is a very scary prospect. But what is it about plastic that makes it so challenging? Well, we've gone through the properties that we think are so great about plastic, but actually those same properties are the ones that actually make it really, really difficult to handle once we've had enough of it. Modern living actually drives the use of plastics, and perhaps there's an interesting contradiction there that we might want to think about. Is it our modern lifestyle that's driven the ubiquitous use of plastic in so many applications, or is it conversely the availability and diversity and use of plastic that's actually driven our modern lifestyle, that leads us to somewhere where we can literally from our office perhaps take a walk across the road and get a cup of coffee in a plastic mug. We can go to the next garage and get a sandwich. We can do all sorts of things that plastic facilitates happening, that instant gratification that we seem to enjoy so much. And whilst plastic in some respects can be quite simple, we've got some fairly easily recognised plastic formats, PET, HDPE, that we know and recognise very readily. Other materials are far more complex in structure. And technology has really, really delighted in developing the functionality of plastics and the complexity of plastics to really deliver so many what industry will consider really exciting opportunities, that by layering it up or putting in additives, adding colours, bonding with other materials, all sorts of exciting things that can be done with plastics, which have actually usually been done for really good reason. Let's face it, nobody's going to spend money on packaging that they don't actually need or think will offer them some improvement or function, but we've been irresponsible in our decision making. We haven't considered what potential losses there might be long term. We haven't considered the consequences of what this wonderful material, which delivers so much, might mean in other areas of the environment. But also, and we don't want to point too much a finger of blame here, we haven't actually required the designers and manufacturers of those products to even consider the full lifetime impact of the products. That's not been our concern. So just to really give a little bit more detail to what exactly is we're talking about with plastic and why it's perhaps a little bit different to other materials. If we think about it in comparison to things like wood or glass, plastic is a little bit different because it's not just one material. It's actually made up of lots of different polymers. And in simple terms, this table here demonstrates the very straightforward polymers that you might actually recognize. And in order to help us recognize that, we have what is a widely adopted numbering system that, whilst not mandatory, is actually recognized globally as being a way to mark a particular piece of plastic. So we know what we've got. And maybe some of you will be looking on your bottles and containers and things in the future and seeing what it is exactly that you've actually been buying. And it might help you to make some decisions about whether or not that's the right kind of packaging material or right kind of material to actually be considering. But that's perhaps not the full story, because one, yes, that's extremely useful to have those things and marked in that way, but actually a lot of the plastics we buy are in very, very small quantities, or perhaps in a flexible material. And if you look at those, you won't find those markers anywhere. So you won't know what those materials actually are. And we're not just talking about categorizing the polymers, but actually the different combinations that appear in the materials that we handle. So for a very simple example, let's look at something like a food tray. Now the food tray itself will be made of one material, and it might come in a variety of colors. It might even come in black, which is very problematic for our recyclers. But then it'll also come with some sort of peel-off lid at the top, and that'll be a different polymer again. And maybe there might be a label on that, and that might be a different polymer again. So whilst it's very tempting to think, well, actually, I can pick up that piece of plastic and put it in my recycling bin and think, job done, in fact, you've probably just given the recyclers a bit of a challenge because they've got some materials there that they don't actually want. Adding to that, the composite materials, so some of the plastic which has been layered, one layer on top of another, there's no classification system for those. So you and I won't know exactly what that material is, and our recyclers won't know what that material is. So we've got another challenge that makes it all the more difficult to know what you're collecting, recycling, and reprocessing. And then added to that, there are even more complexities. Lots of additives get added to our plastics, and this again may impact on the ability to recycle that material, and indeed may contain hazardous materials which you really don't want to enter into the next use. And of course the colours. Well, you can collect colours separately, but then we're struggling as it is to collect just the plastics in one instance. But if you mix all those colours together, well, you're going to end up with a lot of grey. And until quite recently, a lot of the materials that came out of the recycling reprocessing sector would be the low-grade materials that can be produced from this mix of colours that will turn a lovely shade of grey, which is why you might see things like buckets or flower pots or recycling bags actually made out of recycled plastic materials. So there's a real challenge there for the sector in terms of how you recognise the materials and then how you can actually reprocess those materials back into something useful. But also, in terms of recycling, it's got to generate value. There has to be some value in all this operation, otherwise, why do it? And if you've got to put a huge amount of effort in to recover, bring back these materials we use, well, then that's going to cost you more. So for every extra piece of effort to get hold of that material, so additional separation and sorting, that's going to cost more. And capturing many, many small items is probably the most complex and costly of those. And the output of those materials, because we've talked about the mix of polymers and colours and all sorts of things, will have both limited value and or end use. And in that sense, we have to perhaps consider the role for chemical recovery of polymers, or indeed energy from waste, as being part of the mix. So I think probably what I've presented you with is of a picture that is really actually quite difficult. But plastic is a global commodity. It's used everywhere in the world, and it's manufactured almost everywhere in the world. And in fact, we are trading around 15 million tonnes of plastic waste every single year. The recipients for this material have primarily been in the Far East, and that's not perhaps just because it was easier and it's less regulated, but actually because those are the areas who have actually taken on the manufacturing of new plastic products. And within new plastic products, I include the use of recycled content. So although there's been a lot of criticism about plastic waste being exported to these countries, in some respects, much of this material has actually gone into the new products that they are producing. Perhaps what's been the real challenge, and the reason why China, for example, has actually said enough is enough, we don't need the West plastic waste anymore, is the fact that instead of sending them properly sorted and graded plastic for use in their manufacturing sectors, we've actually sent them really, really low grade, almost useless plastic. We have, and this is our own fault, we have used these countries as something of a dumping ground, as it were. So, it's a complex issue, but, we haven't really treated these countries in a way that we should. And also, some of the countries that we're sending materials to are not in the same place as us. European countries and the UK, along with countries like Korea and Taiwan, have got relatively well-developed recycling systems. By recycling, I mean collection systems. So we're well organised, we've got our local authorities collecting, we've got our large-scale BIFA, Viridor, the large-scale companies collecting waste and recycling and reprocessing those materials. We're doing quite well, and we're very particularly proud here in Wales that we are third in the world at the moment for collecting materials for recycling. But other parts of the world don't have these formal structures in place, or if they do have recycling activities going on, then they are less formally organised and are more akin to scavenging activities. And again, looking at some of the pictures that we might find unpleasant when you see small children scavenging across landfill sites, picking out bits of plastic. And then you'll see them sometimes with a disposable lighter and actually setting light to some of these pieces of plastic. They're actually trying to figure out what that plastic is made of and trying to determine the valuable plastics from the less valuable plastics and knowing what's there to be collected. So again, although we have that marking system, it's not going to be available to recognise on all types of material. And then thirdly, it's also worth mentioning illegal activity. There is still a huge trade in the illegal movement of waste. There's the old saying, where there's muck, there's brass, I'm afraid is very, very true in this area. And there may well be material that is illegally traded. So a trader will take your money and then actually dump the material at sea, or they will dump it in illegal sites elsewhere, which will find its way into the rivers and oceans and contribute to the problems that we've talked about. Another way perhaps to think about plastics, and I do apologise the scale of this slide, you may not be able to necessarily see the text fully, but hopefully if you look back at this is from a recent report produced by Resource Futures, and it talks about how we might want to think about plastics in a slightly different way that might help us to really focus on where the efforts really need to be put in terms of changing our approach to plastic use. So very simply, the broad bands are the amount of plastic that is actually being used by weight. So you can see in the middle there, that's the sort of larger scale use in category 3. That's the heaviest things. But if you look again more closely at the little teardrops that are there, the teardrops are relating to the leakage of that material into the environment. So if you look back at category 1, which is the small materials, teeny tiny materials that we tend to use a lot of, so perhaps think things like cotton buds, coffee stirrers, sanitary items, straws. Those are the kind of things which, whilst they don't make up a huge amount of plastic in terms of their weight, in terms of their ability to leak into the environment, that's where the greatest impact is felt. And the same perhaps then in the next category, things which might last a little bit longer, and let's think about things like disposable cups, cutleries, plates, takeaway packaging, carrier bags, that kind of item. Again, high risk of leakage, but are there opportunities perhaps in the way we might change those for different materials? So I won't dwell too long on that slide, but it is worth having a look at that, and perhaps having a look at the Resource Futures report to actually think that there is a slightly different way to think about the way we talk about plastics. So let's come back to who's got the responsibility for this problem. So first and foremost, it has to perhaps lie with the individual. You and I, our behaviour has in part led to some of these problems. We haven't thought about or even understood the impact of our decisions. And we need to really think a little bit further about how do we change what is normal behaviour? How do we get people to really understand what the impact of our decisions, our behaviours are, and how we can start to think about changing that. Then we want to look at, and I'll come back to the people part in more detail, then I want to look at governments and what their role is, what can they do to either provide that carrot or stick that's going to make us change our behaviours, and then also to look at businesses and the role of and responsibilities of business. Are they looking at growth at all costs? Is this economic model that they have followed worth pursuing if this is the outcome that it leads to? Perhaps we can encourage them to think more about their corporate social responsibility. Perhaps this is a point where we can really illustrate the benefits of moving from a linear to a circular model. And perhaps we can start to get them to think about offsetting and future-proofing the risks of resource scarcity in the future, and to think about adopting business models that actually respects the Earth's limits. And at the end of the day, that's to people. Bit of a challenging question again. Is recycling really so difficult? Well, in some instances, yes, it is. It's difficult to recognise materials, it's difficult to know what bin to put it in, etc., etc. But just by one example, let's look at plastic bottles. A standard PET bottle that you buy a soft drink or water in, it's made of PET. It's very easily identified. We all know what a plastic bottle looks like. We all know, and I think I would challenge probably even 5-year-olds to know that they can recycle that plastic bottle. But yet we throw away 16 million bottles every single day in the UK. And only a small percentage of those are actually recycled. Why would that be? Well, we're very proud, again, and I'm sorry for showing off about Wales, we're very proud here in Wales that actually at the curbside, so our local authority collected waste, we actually achieve a 75% recovery of those materials. So at the curbside, we're doing really, really well. So our householders understand they can look at that plastic bottle, they put it in the right bin, it gets to be sent for recycling. But there's a very different picture when we look at perhaps commercial recycling, when we look at recycling on the go. Because in reality, when we look at plastics as a whole, in terms of UK recycling, we're only achieving something like 32%. So why is it for something that is so easily recognised, so readily recyclable? We've got good collection coverage across the UK. We've got good reprocessing infrastructure for PET. And more importantly, we've got a really strong market for that recycled material in the economic sector. So why doesn't that part of it work? Because we still see plastic bottles appearing at every beach cleanup, at every ocean photograph of pollution. We still see that material appearing. I don't have the answer, I have to say at this point, but it really shouldn't be so difficult. We have guiding principles, so just very quickly to remind everyone, and again, who doesn't know these principles? Reduce, reuse, recycle. Why do we keep buying single-use disposable items? Well, is it because changing habits is easier said than done? We are consumers. We are driven to consume. We don't tend to think too much about the other end of it. Are we able to change our behaviour? Could we think about, what some people might consider as sort of slightly backward step to stop using disposable items and organise ourselves so that we are taking our little cutlery wrap with us that's got, not a plastic spoon in it, but has actually got a metal spoon, knife and fork there for us to use. People are starting to think about investing in a reusable bottle, a reusable coffee container, those kind of things. But it does require a higher initial investment at the front end, and it does require planning, and it does require a little bit of extra time from us. And then when it comes to recycling, can we be sure that we can recycle these items? Are the opportunities to recycle convenient and accessible? And is the clarity of message there with what's on our packaging? Perhaps that OPRL, the on-pack recycling label, widely recycled lettering that they use, does that really tell people that they can recycle something, or does that need re-examining? Our colleagues in OPRL will tell us, yes, we do, and they're working very, very hard to improve that labelling, to make it easily understood. And also, I think this is a recent thing, do we trust the market? If you are picking up something and making that effort to have for it to be recycled, are you confident that it's actually being recycled? And is recycling actually a social norm in the UK? When you chuck your plastic bottle on the floor or into the general recycling bin, does somebody else stare and give you the evil eye opposite because it really isn't the right thing to do? Or does it by and large go ignored? So following up, excuse me, I'll just have a quick think. Consumer campaigns. Lots and lots of campaigns at the moment. Anyone who's on social media will see lots and lots of actions that are encouraging us to all go plastic free. We can see plastic free shops emerging in many towns and villages. Even in my own small village, our local veg shop is now converted to plastic free. And we've seen lots of reports and initiatives coming out from organisations like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, Plastic Control, Plastic Pollution Coalition. The BBC are running plastic initiatives, many, many other individual campaigns. And consumers are starting to choose plastic-free options. Here in RAP, we do a lot of work with our local authorities, and they are telling us that they are rapidly fielding phone calls from members of the public, challenging them and saying, what are you going to do? How are you going to address this public issue? And what are you going to do in your premises to reduce the amount of plastic? But one of the challenges I think that they particularly raised is that they want to make change, but they are very conscious that there may be some unintended consequences of making those changes, and that they want to make the right decisions and ensure that they're not, perhaps if they choose to go plastic free, replacing plastic items with other products, perhaps biodegradables or bio-based polymers that might actually lead to more problems than they actually got already. So they're very, very conscious of needing some advice and guidance. And again, RAP is rapidly working on some guidance that will help them through their decision-making processes. So what about governments and what are they doing? Well, quite a lot, I would say, at the moment. Now, forgetting the fact that we're actually leaving the EU, we have signed up to the circular economy package that came through in 2017. And within that, there are a wide range of initiatives that are looking at how we deal with plastics. The UK will be releasing a strategy in this autumn, and there will be, I think they're calling it a plastic waste and recycling strategy. So we are eagerly awaiting to see what that initiative will actually tell us that is going to happen within the UK over the next few years. In addition to that, the devolved nations, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, are also working on their own circular economy strategies, which will develop and build on their individual waste strategies that they already have. And I have to say, perhaps in Scotland and Wales, there is perhaps a slightly, a greater drive, a greater ambition perhaps to take these initiatives further. So we have already existing regulations that govern the collection, transfer, treatment and disposal of waste. We have a number of instruments and acts and bills. So for instance, we have an act in Wales, which is, we hope going forward, going to actually transform some of the collection of commercial and industrial waste going forward. And we've yet to see that actually come into force. But there's also opportunities for taxes and levies. So we are familiar with the landfill tax. We've had the carrier bag levy here in Wales for some time, and of course now it's been introduced in England as well. So there are plenty of opportunities for the government to intervene, to push us forward with either carrots or sticks to actually change behaviours. And of course there's always ultimately, although perhaps this is a last resort, the bans and restrictions that might come into place. Now, one of the key instruments that's being talked a lot about recently is extended producer responsibility. And this is an initiative that's actually already in place, and particularly in relation to packaging. And there have been a number of directives, and then that's been transposed into UK law through the UK producer responsibility obligations in 2007. So there's a little schematic there which actually talks about how this works in the UK. And we actually deliver this in a slightly different way to other parts of Europe, and that different way has perhaps reduced the outcomes that were intended when this was initially put into place. But in essence, very quickly, packaging companies, and they are limited to the larger scale packaging companies, and I'll explain in a little bit more detail on the next slide, are required to sign up to a compliance scheme and then to demonstrate that they are effectively contributing financially to the recycling and reprocessing of the materials that they place on the market. And they have to report back to government to tell people what they're doing. But in the UK, this is a market-based system. So prices can fluctuate, they can go up, they can go down, depending on the amount of material that's available on the market, and also, of course, the global marketplace. So there's been quite a bit of criticism about how this works in the UK, and the limits to which it is actually applied. So at the moment, it only applies to businesses with a turnover of £2 million or more, or those that are placing more than 50 tonnes of packaging actually onto the marketplace per annum. So it's an awful lot of packaging companies that actually aren't captured within this. And although there is an obligation to sign, there are still, unfortunately, a number of companies that should be captured by this, but actually haven't signed themselves up to the schemes that they should have. So as I said, this actually doesn't really generate the level of revenue that would actually cover the cost of recycling these materials. So in 2014, our levy that's captured through this system was about £79 million, whereas in Germany, the amount of money captured was around £950 million. So in the UK, we're only covering around 10% of the actual recycling costs. So it's not really operating in the way that producer responsibility should, because it's still leaving 90% of the cost to be picked up by the market. Another criticism also is that the payment of these PRNs is based on tonnages, not quality. So you get the same for reprocessing a tonnage of fairly poor quality material that, let's say, perhaps might be exported for recycling, as it is that you might get for some really good, well segregated and sorted material. So there's no incentive to the recyclers and the reprocessors or collection organisations to really drive forward improvements. We've just focused on achieving the per tonnage targets that are associated with this. The other thing that's being considered at the moment that we don't have but is widespread across Europe is a deposit return scheme. Lots and lots of conversation about this at the moment. And of course, a lot of people who are my age, and I'm giving things away a little bit here, will widely remember deposit return schemes when you were small and you took back your bottles of pop to the local shop and you got threepence or a 5p or whatever. It's a good way for parents to work up the pocket money for their children. But we don't have these at the moment. But we expect an announcement from the UK government in the autumn that will facilitate the introduction of deposit return schemes in some way. The benefits of this, well, it clearly will incentivise recycling. It has the potential to improve quality because what goes into your sorting machine, actually, it will only accept the right material. So less opportunity for you to make a mistake, put them on wrong material. But we need to be careful about what we're saying can be recycled and what we're targeting in terms of this material. So we need to be really clear of what type of material it is, soft drink bottles, is it about a certain size of bottle as well? But nonetheless, there is a significant opportunity here. And in fact, countries like Norway actually achieve something like a 97% recycling rate for plastic bottles there, which is incredible. Scotland has committed to the adoption of a DRS system, but we're waiting to hear how they will do it. England, as I say, we are awaiting an announcement from DEFRA. Wales will participate in a DRS, but because we've achieved very high recycling rates with our curbside collections, this presents us with something of a challenge, because what we don't want to do is to see a reduction in what comes through the curbside in favour of a deposit return scheme. So there's some swings and roundabouts to be weighed off there. And I'm sure, we will see going forward, the local scout group and schools perhaps using the deposit return scheme as an incentive, one, to teach children about the environment, but also to raise small-scale funds for the schools. So we don't want to see that children are actually removing plastics that are already in the recycling system and actually bringing them just to another place, because then there's no value in actually delivering that. What are the negatives of recycling? Well, there is a high cost to this, and we're not sure who's going to pay for the infrastructure. It could be that primarily that will fall on businesses to actually install and develop this system going forward. And as I said, there is a potential impact for curbside collections. Unfortunately, there's also a possibility of a liability for fraudulent activities, and the systems have got to be set up very carefully to ensure that this isn't the case. So let's look again at what business and industry initiatives there are. As I say, business has very much been in the firing line from the public, and they're certainly being asked to respond to this particular challenge, and they want to be recognised as part of the solution and not part of the problem. Businesses have actually been using recycled materials for many, many years and developing fully recyclable bottles and packaging. But certainly in terms of the use of recycled content, most of them have not been promoting this widely, usually based on the potential perception of consumers in terms of thinking, I'm not really sure that I want to use something that perhaps is in food contact that may have once been recycled and sitting on a dirty beach somewhere. So a lot of suspicion around that. But companies like Coca-Cola have been using recycled content in bottles for actually quite some considerable time. But now we're starting to see lots and lots of different companies coming into this arena and telling us just how much recycled content they're going to be using in their products. And we're maybe going to start to see the development of slightly different business models, particularly from the bottled water sector, who clearly see this agenda as quite a threat, and they may want to look at delivering their bottled waters perhaps in different types of operations. So the illustrations there, as you can see, there's a Marks and Spencer's on the go tub there. That's got some recycled content in it. I'm not talking about the food, I'm talking about the plastic. I think it's the Adidas trainer there, which is made from ocean plastics. You've got an Evian water bottle as well, all made out of recycled plastics. I'm going to move forward with this slide actually, because we are slightly running out of time. So I shall move on to what is our UK Plastics Pact. Now, if you haven't heard about this initiative, it was launched earlier this year, the partnership between Ratwell and MacArthur Foundation, and we're looking at how we can drive the manufacturing sector here in the UK, and there are a number of targets here for them to meet by 2025. This is a voluntary agreement that businesses are paying to actually be part of this agreement, and it really seeks to drive forward behaviours. But there are a number of challenges involved in this. So for instance, we've talked about, just by example, eliminating unnecessary packaging. But actually it's quite difficult to ascertain what we mean by unnecessary packaging. In some respects, packaging is very useful, and it's certainly necessary when we think about safety, resilience, transportation of all the products we use. So actually defining what is the right, what is an unnecessary piece of packaging that we can then get rid of, can be quite complex. We might need to properly redesign that packaging and actually redesign the way we actually present that material to the consumer. And we might need to think about retraining our designers, because designers aren't necessarily thinking about this as a real challenge. They're going to have to think very hard about how they take off perhaps their marketing hat and think much, much more carefully about how they design those products. We've already talked a little bit about the packaging recovery note and how that might change going forward. So we want to make sure that 100% of the plastic packaging underneath the pact is actually reusable, recyclable, or compostable. Again, we need to define what we mean by that, and RAP will be providing a range of industry guidance that could actually help businesses and the manufacturing sector to actually determine exactly what good recyclable, reusable and composting packaging might look like. And we're working very closely with industry, with the industry advisory bodies such as Recoup and the British Plastics Federation, with the On-Pack Recycling Label organisation and others. But perhaps more importantly, we're also working very closely with the waste management sector and with the recyclers and reprocessors who receive this material to ensure that the decisions that are made in terms of redesigning packaging actually are the right decisions, and we are generating material which is readily recyclable by the sector. And of course, not to be forgotten, we want to make sure that we're informing our consumers that this is what's happening and that this is what they will start to see in the supermarket and how they can contribute to that decision making. So we're nearly there. We want to be able to show that those materials are actually and in reality effectively recycled and composted. So this is about building transparency into our recycling systems and actually making sure that we have got the appropriate infrastructure here within the UK, rather than looking at sending materials overseas where we may or may not be able to determine whether actual and real recycling is taking place. We need to invest closer to home in our infrastructure. And we need to actually get some money into the system to determine who's going to pay for this recycling and where it's going to happen. And also, very importantly, if you're recycling all this material, you need to ensure that there's an end market for it, that we have got a use for this material. And as I said in the earlier slide, we're starting to see now more companies actually saying, I am going to put 30% or more packaging, recycled content into my packaged products. So just looking at the infrastructure in the UK very quickly, what have we got? Well, we've got fairly good collections infrastructure, fairly good coverage of the collection of plastics, really good infrastructure, particularly on the collection of bottles. We've got fairly good infrastructure in terms of the collection of packaging materials like pots, tubs, trays, that kind of thing. Less good infrastructure in terms of some of the other more complex materials, particularly we're challenging with film. But we are trialling that now, and we are looking at the opportunities to collect film going forward. In terms of our reprocessing infrastructure, well, as I said, the drive to send materials with less effort being put into the recycling and sorting side of things has led to a lot of material going overseas and going for export. And that's had a knock-on effect on our recycling sector here in the UK. It's made it very difficult for them to invest. It's made it very difficult for them to survive in what is a very volatile marketplace. And so, although we are generating fairly significant amounts of plastic waste within the UK, we don't necessarily have sufficient reprocessing and recycling infrastructure to actually manage that. We've got, I think, somewhere in the region of 800,000 tonnes of reprocessing capacity here in the UK, but that's against an arising figure of something like 3.4 million. So it clearly doesn't meet that at the moment, and we need to drive forward that investment. It can take somewhere in the region of £20 million to actually set up a new recycling facility. So clearly that's a huge commitment, but that's nonetheless what we need to see. moving forward. So what do we need to do? I'm rapidly closing up here because I want to make sure that you've got the opportunity to ask a few questions. What are we going to do? We're going to need to invest. We need to invest in building that reprocessing capacity. We need to invest in improving our collection scheme, particularly on the go. We need to give confidence to our consumers that when they do recycle goods and materials, they are being recycled. And we need to reward that behaviour in some way. Perhaps that's through a deposit return scheme. We need to give our businesses clarity and consistency and confidence in terms of what regulations are going to look like going forward, so that they can make their investment decisions on some degree of certainty of what's going on. And I've added Brexit at the bottom there because I have to say that is the one thing at the moment that perhaps will hold back developments of this area, because of the uncertainties around Brexit, and also because in some respects there are other things going on which will need to be resolved before we move into recycling and reprocessing. So, do we have confidence? Can we make the necessary change to address some of these really significant challenges? My view, yes, I think we can. It is going to take time. We're setting ourselves targets at the moment which take us through to 2025, and I fully expect to see a very different landscape going forward by the time we reach 2025. I think we will be starting to reduce the amount of plastic waste we generate. I think we will place more value on the plastic that we use. We'll be ensuring that more of the materials that we use are actually recyclable and that they will be being recycled. We'll be capable of doing much more of the recycling here within the UK and as a second choice perhaps across Europe, and that we will be using those recycled materials in the products that we see coming onto the marketplace. So to summarise, I do think that in the very near future we will be seeing the right plastics actually in the right place. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. That was really interesting. You certainly covered a huge amount of content there, which is great. And there's been several questions come in.
Sure.
The first one I'm going to ask you, when we, back in June, the IES ran a series of plastic ocean screening events, one of which Susan actually sat on the panel for, to give you a bit of context. And across those 3 different events that questions were discussed, and this actually was quite a common theme. So I just want to speak to you in a bit more detail. So Hannah submitted the question saying, how do we get companies to stop adding a premium to recycled products, which people are buying them, while recycled and so-called eco goods are considered niche, and commercial sectors seem to be able to make a profit extensively, instead of and this isn't necessarily helping people change that habit because they're being met by this extra cost. What are your thoughts around that?
I agree. I think this is something of a challenge. Unfortunately, when it comes to recycled materials, because of some of the challenges that I've spoken about in the presentation, the cost of recycled materials, so let's say, for example, an rPET as opposed to a virgin PET material, PET material, is actually higher than the virgin material. Now, that seems a really strange anomaly, and in some respects, it really shouldn't be the case. But as I said, this is because we are using a free market to recycle and reprocess these materials. And it's just unfortunate that in some respects, if a business is committed to using recycled materials in its products, then it's actually costing them more money. And unfortunately, they will pass that on to the consumer. And this does come back to the fact that we do need to value these materials more carefully and to think more carefully about what we're doing. Now, I think the opportunity is perhaps comes through in the extended producer responsibility schemes, and that may well start to address some of this and perhaps level the playing field a little bit, because the cost of recycling and reprocessing, yes, will be picked up by industry, but it will be picked up by all industry, not just those who are driving forward the use of recycled content. So we're leveling the playing field there, and perhaps we'll start to see the cost of some of these materials coming back down to a more acceptable price without that additional premium.
Okay, so it's, if anything, it's more of an initial extra cost that we're seeing as the system's changing, and over time, hopefully, like you say, it'll be absorbed by more players rather than just the consumer.
Absolutely.
I've got another question from Aaron, who actually asks in a little bit more detail, what makes the Welsh Recycling Initiative so successful in comparison to others?
It all hinges around a blueprint. We developed a blueprint many years ago for our local authorities to work to. And essentially what the blueprint does is it sets out a sort of best practice model for local authorities to collect the material, which will give them the best value in terms of collecting materials separately, which the intention is that in collecting those materials separately at the curbside, that they'll have a better quality of material which they can then sell on to reprocessors, which generates more income for them from those materials. So the blueprint has been rolled out across Wales. We have, of the 22 local authorities we have in Wales, 13 are fully signed up to the blueprint and are working to that model. And a number of the others are also on that journey of moving towards the blueprint. So unlike perhaps the slightly more variable collection schemes that we've got across other parts of the UK, all Welsh local authorities have got food waste collections, plastic, glass, paper, card, all being done separately. They've also got options for textiles, those kind of things, all building up. Now, they don't all deliver that in exactly the same way. That would be, that's the holy grail. And they've got different colour systems that they've adopted. And there are different practicalities which are based around regional variations, such as city centres and, very rural areas. So they've all have the ability within the blueprint to develop something differently, but they are all working to this sort of overarching model, which has enabled them to drive forward really good quality recycling. And there's also been an investment package that's backed that up, coming from government, that has enabled them to invest in curbside recycling vehicles, and also the necessary training for the people who work on those vehicles. And we have in Wales part of our RAP team, which is called the Collaborative Change Programme. And we do a lot of modelling for local authorities that helps them to work through their particular challenges. So if they've decided that they want to look at perhaps something like glass recycling as a separate item, they can model that and see how that will work for them, how they might address some of the noise issues, how they might look at, providing information for their citizens, their householders, and how they can guide them through making sure that they get the right thing in the right bin, etc., etc. So we're very fortunate to be able to do that. Yes, we're lucky. We're only working with 22 local authorities as opposed to the hundreds that exist in England, perhaps. But it would be lovely to see that adopted more widely across the UK.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense, and hopefully that some of those initiatives will be spread out across the UK and a little bit more. On the theme of local authorities, Alan Clark has actually asked a question about how some local authorities in England incinerate rather than recycle, generally due to the fact that it's cheaper to do so, and therefore losing the materials from the circular economy. Without moving house, and because people can't choose their local authority without doing so, how do we as citizens encourage them to choose recycling and kind of encourage them to choose a different system that is more beneficial?
Yeah, this is a difficult challenge, particularly when we're in the situation we are in at the moment, where China has closed its doors to our recycling of a lot of materials. So I've talked about plastics, but actually that extends to other materials as well. So paper and card are also subject to some of the bans for low quality recycled materials. So there are a number of critical elements, perhaps relating perhaps to the last question, which is actually a lot of the materials that are collected in England, whilst they might be collected as dry recyclers, are collected in a mixed stream. And once those materials are in a mixed stream, they are of a lower quality generally than those that are collected separately. So you've already got something which has less value to it and perhaps can't be delivered immediately to the reprocessor. We've also got a lack of infrastructure for recycling here in the UK, so the options are limited. However, we have invested, there's been government choices to invest in incineration infrastructure, and as you say, it does provide a cheap option for disposal. And is a cheap option for a local authority that is really feeling the squeeze. And I think this year particularly, we've started to see a lot of reports coming through for local authorities who are in serious financial difficulties, and therefore anywhere that they can save even small amounts of money, they are inclined to perhaps choose that as an option. So what do we do about that? One, I think, lobby your local authority, stand up and shout about it and tell them you don't like it. There is a degree of people power, and if your local councillors and your local MPs want to be re-elected, make your voice heard. Tell them that this is a really, really important issue for you. I'm convinced that this is actually from maybe I would say a period of probably 10 years or more where environment hasn't been on the political agenda, or certainly hasn't been on particularly high on the agenda. I think we will see a resurgence of this. So please use your people power to put that pressure on. In a slightly longer term, I think we will start to see change as we are, and we hope, and please watch the DEFRA announcements and the government announcements in the autumn, that we will see money going into the development of recycling and reprocessing infrastructure across the whole of the UK, and the investment in extended producer responsibility. Perhaps one of the important things about the producer responsibility schemes is at the moment, most of the money that comes through our existing producer responsibility schemes goes through the reprocessors. It doesn't necessarily get directed in any real volume to the collection schemes. Now, if we redevelop that producer responsibility scheme as is planned, or as we hope will be adopted by the UK government, then we will see a lot more of that money being made available to the local authorities to collect materials. And as long as that is planned and delivered properly, in other words, we are offsetting some of the cost to the local authorities, which is coming out of their key coffers, as it were, can actually be paid for by the manufacturers who place this material on the market, then we could see significant changes in how that material is handled. So this is a very, very busy area at the moment. And if there is the opportunity to really push your local authority and your local MP and tell them that this is really, really important to you, then please do it.
I think that's a really good point, and there's a couple of questions statements really that have come in to say exactly that actually it is producers and businesses that are putting these products on the market and making them complex to recycle, and therefore that they should be absorbing the costs a little bit more. One thing I did want to say is there does seem to be a huge amount of consumer pressure on lobbying your local government, your local authority, or going into supermarkets and returning the plastic, all those kind of things that came out of the back of World Environment Day this year. But actually, I think it's quite hard to find out that information and how you actually do that. How do you suggest to the average consumer who doesn't know an awful lot about how their local authority does manage their waste, how do you go about doing that and actually finding that information and lobbying them in an effective way?
There's a number of ways. You can obviously go to them directly, and if they don't really seem to know, then if you really, really want to push them, you can go for a freedom of information request, which they are obliged to answer. You could also try coming to us at RAP. We can provide a certain degree of information. It might not give you the level of detail you want at a local level, but it can certainly give you some of the broader information at a UK-wide level. Another area that you will also be able to fall on is the recording system that all local authorities have to report into, which is the waste data flow system. So in England, that's operated by the Environment Agency, and in Wales by NRW. And you can also put in a request there, which will give you information about the end destination of materials that are collected by your local authorities. So it's a complex, convoluted idea, but, and also join up to some of your local campaign groups. They'll often be quite well informed about how to get hold of this information and can help you out in that respect.
Thank you. That's good. It's nice to have some answers and some clear pointers for people to go back on. Ruth Fitzgerald has actually said, do you know if there are any options being worked on with local authorities to bring back local water fountains and options to easily refill our water bottles so that we can reuse them?
Yes, I can't speak for England at the moment. I'm sure there are things going on, but certainly here in Wales, the Welsh Government is working very closely with Welsh Water, and we are hoping sometime in the near future, it's been announced by our minister, to become the very first refill nation. The idea is to start by introducing refill points all the way around our coastal footpath. So we have a coastal footpath that goes all the way around the edge of Wales, incorporating national parks and all sorts of beautiful areas. And the idea is to engage with businesses, local authorities, all sorts of organisations to actually develop a network of water fountains. We also hope to see this expanded on in the towns and city centres. So quite exactly how that will be implemented, whether it'll be the sort of old-fashioned public water fountains of old, probably not, because there are all sorts of issues around health and hygiene and those kind of things. It'll be more likely to be sort of dispenser units, maybe co-located with our deposit return schemes, and they will provide you with the opportunities to refill a water bottle. There's been some conversations with our bottled water companies. We have quite a few of those in Wales, and whether they might actually sponsor some of those refill stations. There's even been suggestions of trials where you could perhaps buy your initial water bottle, whether it's an Evian or Brecon Carreg or whatever water bottle, and that you would buy that bottle with a chip on the bottom of it, that you could go to any refill station and actually refill your bottle, 20 times before the chip has run out, and things like that. So yeah, I mean, far better that we are able to see these completely free of charge, but there are certainly initiatives on the cards. So watch what happens in Wales, and then maybe we'll see that can happen across the rest of the UK as well.
Yeah, excellent. Sounds very exciting. And Paul Linwood has also posted a link in the chat box about a refill campaign that Southern Water are doing in the area as well. So it sounds like there are definitely local things going on, and hopefully things that will spread across the country.
Yeah.
And we have actually run out of time, so I'm afraid that's it in terms of the questions. If you do have any further ones, then please do contact Susan. She's put her details on the screen for you all to access that. And for those that did log in, please make sure you record this as CPD on our CPD tool. Just log into the members area, and if you've got any problems with that, just contact us at the project office and we can help you. And just finally, just a massive thank you to you, Susan. Like I say, you did sit on our panel at a plastic ocean screening in Bristol back in June, which was excellent, and this came off the back of that. So thank you for your support, and thank you for doing this webinar. I think you've really provoked some discussion, which will hopefully be carried on as well outside of this. So yeah, thank you.